Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Teach the Geek interviews. My name is Neil Thompson, founder of Teach the Geek. It's an online platform for science and engineering professionals. The first offering of the platform is a public speaking course called Teach the Geek to Speak. To learn more about it, you can go to teachthegeek.com. Again, that is teachthegeek.com. Today, my guest is Paolo Gaudiano, and he is all things diversity and inclusion. And we're certainly going to get into more of it during this interview, but he has three endeavors essentially that are devoted to D&I. His startup, Aleria, and then he has a nonprofit, the Aleria Research Corporation, and then also in conjunction with City College of New York, he has the Quantitative Studies of Diversity and Inclusion Initiative. So I'm really interested to learn more about these three endeavors, and of course, we'll get into public speaking as well. Welcome to Teach the Geek interviews, Paolo.
Thank you, Neil. Really appreciate being invited to speak with you and with your audience. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. So from the bit of research I did on you, Paolo, you were in school for quite some time. You have 3 degrees. So you started off in applied mathematics, then you went to aerospace engineering, and then you got a PhD in cognitive and neural systems. These are all like 3 varying disciplines. So what was the motivation for getting all those 3 degrees?
You know, I joke with people that the polite word that people use is interdisciplinary, but the true word is like scattered, I guess. No, the fact is I've always thrived on variety. I've always thrived on being able to do multiple things, but there's always been a common thread. And I would say the common thread throughout my work has been in part the ability to combine computational sciences with behavioral sciences. So whether it was, as an undergraduate, I was really learning engineering. So it was really kind of a basic background, applied mathematics, and mathematics kind of pervades almost every side of engineering and science. But then my master's in aerospace engineering, I actually started studying the brain a lot and a lot of neural networks and AI and things like that. And then became fascinated with the field. And then in the PhD, I really learned how to apply that much more systematically. And then eventually embarked on an academic career looking at that intersection between cognitive science, neuroscience, and computer science, and eventually migrated my way to more social sciences, such as the work that I'm doing now in diversity and inclusion.
From what I understand, most people, when they get PhDs, at least when they start out in them, their goal is to eventually get a position in academia, typically a tenure track position. And that seems like what you did. But at some point, you decided to leave that and go off and do something else. What was the reason for leaving academia?
Yeah, it was further proof of my craziness. I love teaching. I've always loved teaching, and in fact, I continue to maintain a tie with academia. But so I went the typical career path. I did my PhD, and then I was offered an opportunity right after the conclusion of my PhD to become a professor, and I loved it. But what I realized with the years is that I was very much into building things that work and doing things with a sense of urgency, with a sense of accomplishment. And I felt that in academia, at least the environment that I was in, sometimes that applied mindset is kind of looked down upon. And I was very active as a consultant. I'd done a number of projects. I was given an opportunity to go and become chief scientist of a new entity that a company had started. I tried to think about doing a leave of absence, and that wasn't working out. So I thought, you know what? I really want to be an entrepreneur. I really want to make a mark and do something more tangible and more practical. And so I gave up my tenured position to become an entrepreneur. As I said, I maintain ties with academia, and over the years, I have actually taught first at Tufts University, then at City College, and actually very, very recently, starting this fall, I'm teaching also at NYU in the business school. So I maintain that love for academia and for teaching, but I would not go back. I'm delighted that I made the decision to become a full-time entrepreneur.
So, also what I understand from being tenure track, it's pretty much it's a guaranteed kind of gig. It's real difficult to get fired once you become tenured. So you gave that security up to become an entrepreneur. Would you have ever made that the decision to go from, I guess, the security of a tenure track position to maybe not full security, but the security of a job at a corporation? A non-entrepreneurship job?
I have to say, I would never be able to work in a real company, quote unquote. I spent quite a number of years as a consultant. It was very creative R&D type consulting, again, blending this analytics and behavioral sciences. And through that work, I worked with a lot of people, Fortune 500, government agencies. And as much as I enjoyed interacting with some of the people with whom I interacted, I thought I could never do that. I could never be in a position where I have 6 layers on top of me, or maybe even 10 layers below me, whatever the case might be, but being beholden to a whole large structure and regulations and rules is something that I would find very difficult. And yes, I gave up basically a guaranteed permanent job, but I'm very much of a risk seeker. I enjoy risks. My diversity and inclusion career really is brand new. It's only 5 years old. And when I started that, I basically threw away a lot of what I had, including money, and to embark on these ventures. But it's just, I love that. I love the kind of the excitement of creating something new, and I don't mind the risk. And I'm very fortunate that my wife is very patient with me that way.
So where did this interest in diversity and inclusion come from?
Yeah, and I get the question a lot because as a straight cisgender white man, I'm not the most common representative of diversity and inclusion. I came into it what used to be a personal interest, and it's funny because now in retrospect it was a very, very amateurish interest. But I grew up in a different country. I was born and raised in Italy. I've lived in multiple countries. I speak multiple languages. So when I came to this country, I remember being perplexed by some of the things that I saw. And then what happened is that about 6 years ago, I had this realization that some of the work that I've been doing as a consultant, which was specifically looking at the behaviors of employees in organizations and how to help manage those, I realized that that could potentially be helpful in understanding how diversity and inclusion play out in the success of an organization. And so I thought, wow, this would be fantastic if I could combine my professional work with my passion for actually making the world a better place. So I literally dropped everything. I spent about a year doing research, developing some of my models, and convinced myself fairly quickly that that was an incredible opportunity. And so I literally sunk what little investments I had and all of my time into starting these entities. And it's been a fantastic journey. And I have to say that now that I am 100%, this is all I do. I live and breathe doing diversity and inclusion. Even though I'm doing it for 3 different angles, it's all kind of the same work. It has become significantly more important to me. And I've learned to appreciate how, as a white man, I have a very important responsibility, because ultimately it is people like me and myself that create these problems, that create these and sustain, whether willingly or unwillingly, these systems of systemic racism and bias. And we have to do something about it. We can't just stand by. And once you see that, it's very difficult to just stand by and ignore it. And so now I'm much more passionate about it than I used to be.
So I know there are a number of people out there that perhaps they start nonprofits or they start startups, but you started 3 different things. Was that always the plan to do all 3, or did you start one then saw the need for the other 2?
It was more sequential, and partly because of the fact that my background had been so varied. I had experience in multiple fields, so I knew the strengths and weaknesses of each model. But I started out with just Aleria, and the goal was build some software that will help corporations understand the value of D&I, how to interpret it, what to do about it, most importantly, and not just say, oh yeah, in general, companies that are more diverse are better, but like, how will this impact my company? Then I thought, well, having had experience before, I know that it's very difficult to build a software company and a research company at the same time. So in collaboration with Gilda Barbino, who used to be the Dean of Engineering at City College, we founded QUISD, Quantitative Studies of Diversity and Inclusion, which I saw as a way of doing core research. And then shortly thereafter, I realized that the missing ingredient was the nonprofit. And the reason there was that we kept getting asked to look at problems related to diversity and inclusion outside of corporate. And I didn't want to get distracted. And I realized there was also a lot of opportunity to get funding from foundations and other organizations to do really meaningful societal work. And so we created that 3rd entity and really found that the 3 entities together work beautifully. It was very hard initially because it looked like a distraction, but now that we've kind of hit a stride, it works really well. We may be working with an academic entity and then bring in the nonprofit, potentially identify opportunities for the for-profit, and very often it goes the other way around. Somebody approaches us on the for-profit side and we can direct some business or potentially some sponsors to the academic side or some business to the nonprofit. So it was a bit, I don't want to say entirely serendipitous, but it was something that evolved over time. I didn't start out thinking I'm going to do 3 things. If I had, I probably would have decided not to do anything because I had no idea how much work I was getting into.
Yeah, for sure. So when it comes to, when you mentioned with Aleria, you provide companies with software to address D&I. So when the company gets this software, what kind of, what output do they get from this software, and what typically is the the call to action from the output of that software?
The most unique thing, and this has evolved over time, we found one particular thing. Our software in principle can look at many aspects of it, but we found one thing that was truly unique and valuable, which is that we have identified a way of quantifying and measuring inclusion. And when people talk about D&I, if you think about it, the vast majority of the data that we get and the vast majority of the initiatives all really focus on the diversity. You know, it's about representation, it's about numbers, it's about, you know, how many Black people, how many white people, how many Asians, et cetera. Inclusion, on the other hand, we realize is extremely important because it's what determines how you will feel within a corporation, how you will perform, and that ultimately reflects on the entire organization. We found a way to quantify that gave us a way of literally measuring inclusion by involving people in these workshops where we use our software to collect information in a very natural way, which feels like you're engaging in a conversation. But then we go back to the founders and to the company leadership, and in a completely anonymous and aggregated way, we can say, look, here's the problem that you have. People in your company feel disrespected because of some particular set of issues, and it's extremely bad for Black women. It's not quite as bad for white women and for Black people, for Black men, and it's really non-existent problem for white men. And we can literally see in living colors where you're having issues and what exactly those issues are. And that leads companies to be able to come up with super tailored initiatives that can address very specific problems for very specific groups of people. For example, we're working with a company right now that identified that they had an issue with management not being inclusive in how they organized and ran meetings, and that particularly women and women of color were being subjected to feelings of exclusion in various ways. And we were able to say, create a training program for your managers and tell them these are exactly the things that they're doing. This is the negative impact that it's having. And here's the positive ROI that you can get by training your managers to be more sensitive about these issues.
When it comes to the software that you provide to these companies, is it companies coming to you asking for the software, or do you have to present a business case to these companies and why your product is important?
I would say up until now, it's been more of the latter. We have to present the case. But one of the things that we realized as part of in fact, the software that we have two kinds of software. We have the software that we use to collect the initial data. And now currently we're developing an app, which is not finished yet, but we're very close to being finished, that once we've done this initial, what we call the inclusion assessment, the app enables individual employees on their phone or on their desktop to provide very confidential information about situations in which they may feel excluded. And we provide them instant feedback, we give them advice, and then we use that also to collect data on an ongoing basis. And based on the feedback that we have from current clients who are dying to get their hands on the software, I suspect that once we launch the app, it will probably be extremely popular. Because imagine being able to do things like, hey, I measured inclusion, I find out that I have a problem here, I do an initiative, and now a month later, not a year later after I fired 50 people and hired 50 people to check how the needle has moved, a month later, I can see whether people are feeling more included as a direct result of what I've done. So we expect that once we launch the app, probably early next year, that will really sell itself, because it will answer a lot of the questions and demands that companies have about how to become more accountable about D&I, but also how to measure the impact and see change.
I know you had mentioned that with the measurement of inclusion, it provides, obviously it provides that measurement, and then how the particular, I guess, variable affects the different groups within an organization. Does the software also provide, I guess, some sort of prioritization as to what variable to attack first?
Yeah, absolutely. We, over the course of, so this was a combination of the research that I've been doing for years and then working with multiple clients. We have developed a list of what we call the inclusion categories. So we measure two dimensions. One is the inclusion categories, and there are things like work-life balance, workplace interactions, career advancement opportunities, and so on and so forth. But then the other thing that is key is that we also have a way of measuring the sources, because when people feel excluded, it's not in a vacuum. You don't feel excluded because you were having a bad day. You feel excluded because your manager did something, because the leadership did something, because your peers, maybe your customers are doing things that are making you feel excluded. So what we do is we prioritize along those two dimensions, and we say, your real problem area is lack of respect on the part of managers that affects mostly people of color. So it's very, very granular, very actionable because you can see exactly what is happening and then be able to react to it in an appropriate fashion.
And then also, another question I had about that. So you said that it prioritizes the groups that are more affected by the variable that's being looked at. Does it also look at perhaps the percentage of those groups that are affected by that variable? So for instance, if Black women are the most affected by a particular variable, can the software say that it's actually 60% of the Black women feel excluded and 40% don't, or is it just that Black women are affected the most?
No, it's a bit more nuanced than that, because what you can do is imagine kind of a grid where, on the, each column represents a particular source of exclusion, which could be, again, management, HR, policies, whatever the case may be, and each row represents a category like respect, recognition, etc. You may see a cell that's at the intersection of two of those. And then what you can do is you can say, as long as you have enough data, the larger the company, the more data you get. But you can see, for example, you can say things like, of the 75 women, Black women who participated in our inclusion workshop, 65 of them complained about this particular intersection between respect and management. And you can measure things like how often certain categories are brought up. So you can slice and dice the data in many different ways. But really, the percentages of that kind are, the thing that's shocking when people look at it is two things. One of them is we have this analogy that we say that inclusion is invisible. In a way similar to health, right? You don't notice when you're healthy. I didn't say, hey, I'm very healthy today, right? But if you'd seen me a week ago, I had a brace on my shoulder because I actually had a biking accident and my shoulder was dislocated, right? So you might have said, oh, what happened to you? Inclusion is the same way. You don't notice being included, you notice being excluded. But there is an interesting side effect, which is that if you are a white, typically, I'm generalizing here, but if you're a white male, cisgender, straight leader of a company, you're never feeling excluded, which means that you have no idea what's going on and it's invisible to you. So we do these exercises, we measure the data, and then we can show you these kind of heat maps of exclusion. For white men, it looks completely flat. Then you show it, let's say, for white women, and you see a few peaks here and there. Then you show it for Black people, and it's like, boom, right? And you get like these, yeah. And, I'm glad you're like, I mean, the fact is, it's amazing. It's astounding. It's astounding. And what's interesting is that, I've been in this field long, I will never know what it's like to be a Black woman. I will never know what it's like to be a Black man. But when you hear the stories over and over again, and then you see the data and you show it to people that don't get it, it's like, my God, it's like, I get it now. I can see why I am not exposed to this, because you know what? Because if I'm in a meeting and the manager, if I'm the CEO, the manager will never interrupt me. The manager will never take my idea. The manager will never forget to invite me, right? But if I'm a Black woman, that happens all the time. And if I'm a Black man, that happens quite a lot as well. So being able to visualize that and show the stark difference between different groups within the organization. And by the way, I'm using Black women and people of color in general. It's actually very universal. So there is no question that intersectionality is a huge tax. It's a huge, huge burden. There is no question that people of color in general have a much worse experience than white people, and that within different ethnicities, there are definite gradients. It's in this country, being Black, and I don't need to tell you, right? But it's amazing to see the data that shows you that being Black in a company in this country is very different from being Hispanic, and it's very different from being Asian. And so making those kinds of sort of anecdotal things come to life in data is astounding. It just really makes people, it jars people to their senses. And then the beauty is that we're not saying, oh, now you got to throw your company on and start all over again and train everybody, do what Starbucks did, and let's shut down all our stores and give 2 hours of unconscious bias training. It's like, oh, well, that's going to be really useful, right? Instead, it's more like, yeah, take this group of people, show them what they're doing. And it doesn't have to be like, oh, you're a bad person. It's like a lot of times people don't realize they're doing that. But if you can show them exactly what they're doing and how that's negatively impacting the bottom line of the company, believe me, that's going to drive change. And that's ultimately what we're all about. It's driving change.
Yeah, that all sounds great, Paolo. So when it comes to public speaking now, I obviously, well, maybe I'm assuming, but what are the topics that you enjoy speaking about?
I love speaking about many different things, but ever since I started working in the space, I love talking about this work, because to have the incredible privilege and luck of doing something that you love and that really can change the world is, I think it's unique. I mean, I consider myself incredibly fortunate because there are very, very few people that have that fortune. So for me, anytime that I can get up and talk about this work is doubly satisfying. First, because it's a passion for me, but secondly, because nothing gives me more pleasure than to walk into a room full of people who look like me and to just watch their faces, and to just see kind of like the sudden realization in their eyes. And then conversely, sometimes it's equally rewarding to walk into a room of people who don't look like me and actually see people nodding and people going like, yeah, this is exactly what we're seeing, et cetera, et cetera. So I love talking about this work. I've probably given talks. I do a ton of public speaking, and I've probably talked without exaggerating, at least like 15 completely different scientific fields and topics. But this by far has been my favorite one, without question.
Have you always been good at public speaking? And if not, what did you do to get better at it?
It's funny that I'm one of these lucky people that I love getting up and speaking. I love doing public speaking. And even as an undergraduate, I started being a TA, and my professors would realize that I was very good and they would actually have me give entire lectures as an undergraduate. And then of course, as a, master's PhD professor, I did a ton of teaching. I always thought that I was naturally good, but one of the things that I realized as I became more professional is that it doesn't matter how good you think you are, you can always get much better. And I try very hard. And if I had to give a tip to the more seasoned speakers who may be, listening to this, is that it doesn't matter how good you think you are, you can always get better. And so I try to be, on the one hand, confident about the fact that I know that I can be a compelling speaker, but also try to be humble in recognizing that in any given context, I can probably do better. So if I can find somebody to give me feedback or get some help, that's certainly something that I would recommend to everybody. There are speaking coaches. I worked with this incredible woman. I don't know if you know, but I gave a TED talk about 2 years ago. And they let me work with this woman that works with the TED organization. Her name is Kelsey Crouch. And she made such an enormous difference in the quality of my TED talk. I mean, I look at it and I was like, that's a TED talk. What I was giving before was like a lecture, and that was radically different. So I would strongly advise anybody that is very, very serious about public speaking to consider working with a coach, to consider making sure that they're getting feedback, filming themselves, watching themselves very closely, asking other people for their opinions.
Yeah, practice makes progress, that's for sure.
Yeah.
So also, when it comes to your presentations, do you have a process for putting them together? And if so, what is it?
One of the things that I don't like about preparing presentations is that by now, if I had to look through my hard drive and figure out how many PowerPoint files I have, it's, I don't know, literally hundreds of thousands of slides. So I try to make sure, I always think first about what is my story going to be? How is it going to start? How is it going to end? And then I try to make sure, aside from the usual tips like practice, 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 but I try to make sure that I get rid of every possible thing that it does not need to be in the presentation. And also be very careful about simple tricks, like things like make sure that you have, use the contrast checker to make sure that your contrast is sufficiently high, your fonts are very big, very practical things that can make the difference between, you may have the best content in the world, but if somebody in the audience cannot see the writing because maybe they're a little bit older and they're sitting in the back, or if you have too many bullet points, so little simple things like that can suddenly turn a beautiful presentation into kind of a horror story. So you really need both. You need the clarity of the content, but also the quality of the formatting, let's say, of the presentation.
I know you said that ever since your undergraduate days, you've always been pretty good at public speaking, but do you ever get nervous before you give a presentation? And if so, how do you deal with your nerves?
It's funny. I never really get nervous. Sometimes I get more, I don't know, excited. Feels like a bit of an adrenaline rush. As I said, I feel it's almost unfair how lucky I was to, somehow I was born with a brain wiring that always made it very easy for me to talk to people. And I don't know if it was because of my parents. My mom is an incredibly eloquent person. And so we always had very long, engaging conversations and we talked to people. I don't know if that's it or if it's just luck, but I honestly have never really had, if I've had times when it's like, oh my God, I'm going to talk to an audience of 500 people and, maybe it's a sales presentation, right? Where there's something big on the line. I just try to remind myself that, look, I'm having fun. I'm talking to people about something that I love. And I'm really excited about conveying to them something that I love. And when I do that, it's very difficult to get nervous because I don't feel like I'm not there to be judged. I'm not there to be, people are not looking at me to say, oh, is he a good speaker or a bad speaker? I want to tell them a story, and hopefully they're there to hear my story and not to judge how I look or what I'm saying.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. This has been really interesting learning more about you, Paolo. Is there anything else that you'd like to add about the things that you're working on?
I would say in terms of things that I'm working on, I'm super excited about the fact that I'm going to start teaching a course on social entrepreneurship at NYU. I think it's something that I'm really excited because it kind of brings to full circle my teaching with the work that I'm doing. And I would leave one last piece of advice because I talked about how professional speakers can, work with coaches, et cetera. If you're not a professional speaker, if you're not comfortable speaking, if you're relatively young, there are thousands of ways that you can find to make yourself speak publicly. You can volunteer at a local church. You can look for pitch competitions if you're an entrepreneur. You can volunteer to give a guest lecture in a class. Any excuse that you can find to force you to get out there in less stressful situation will do two things. It will give you invaluable practice and it will help you to get increasingly comfortable. So I would leave with that because there are not that many people that are really high quality public speakers. There are many that aspire to be better speakers. And for those, I would just say, find every excuse you can to talk to people.
Wonderful. How can people get in touch with you, Paolo?
More than welcome to reach out to me on LinkedIn or by email. I have so many emails, one for every entity. The easiest one would be my Aleria email, which is Paolo, Paolo @aleria.tech. So aleria.tech. I always welcome, always love meeting interesting people. I may not be able to answer immediately given all the work that I'm doing, but either that or LinkedIn is a great way to get in contact with me as well.
Wonderful. Well, everyone, that marks the end of another edition of Teach the Geek interviews. My name is Neil Thompson, founder of Teach the Geek. It's an online platform for science and engineering professionals. If you so choose to, you can check out Teach the Geek to Speak. It's a public speaking course, and you can get access to it from teachthegeek.com. Again, that's teachthegeek.com. Until next time, take care and stay safe. Thanks, Paolo.
Thank you, Neil. Really appreciate it. Take care, everybody.